Start with believe that you can do something and go from there.
Hi, I'm Karl Vaters, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry. My guest in this episode is Barbara Stanley, and we'll be talking about disability inclusion in the small church. Barb oversees Wonderful Works Ministry, which equips churches to serve families affected by disability. They have a large and growing set of resources to help churches of all types. In this conversation, Barb and I will be talking about why disability inclusion matters, how to come alongside families who are affected by disability, how every church can take some simple first steps toward disability inclusion, and even how to deal with some of the changing language around disability. And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with my quick take on what I learned shortly after recording this interview when my wife and I took our grandkids to a newly refurbished playground that was built in a way that opens everything to every child, no matter what their physical challenges might be, and what those lessons can be for our churches. Well, Barb Stanley, welcome to the Church Lobby.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it is good to have you here. I am not very familiar with your ministry at all. So unlike most of my interviews where I've had a book and I've read it thoroughly, and I'm going to explore this subject with my listeners because it's such an important subject. And we're going to talk about disability inclusion in the church and for our audience, primarily, specifically in the smaller church. You oversee a ministry called Wonderful Works Ministry. Describe what that is and how you became involved in it.
Yes, so Wonderful Works Ministry, we create resources that helps churches learn how to serve students who have disabilities and their families. So we do a lot of video trainings, we have classroom tools, basically the tools that you need to be able to serve people well. This came about because I grew up in a family affected by disability. My older brother has autism and intellectual disability, and he was born back in 1969. And we lived in West Virginia. So there were no resources for our family at that time at all. Back then, people didn't even know what autism was. Like the average person had never heard of it. So it's a completely different world. And it can be very, very isolating for families because your life does look differently than everyone else's. And the one place we were able to go and feel normal was church. Now, that is really unusual. But I think two things were in play. One, back in the 70s and 80s, church probably looked a lot more like some of the small churches where you didn't have like the big rock concert going on. There weren't a million things happening. So because it was a lot of people that you already knew and it wasn't so overwhelming, that was an easier place to take someone with autism. So that was in our favor. And then also, I really just feel like God had this whole ministry planned out ahead of time. And so he knew that when those people in our town planted those seeds of Christian love into my heart during that time, that would come back later now.
That's fascinating. Let's explore that a little bit. So years ago, because I've been going to church since I was, in 1959. I'm about to I just hit my birthday. And so I've been alive in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, O's, ones, and oh my goodness, I've lived in 8 different decades at this point. I've only missed the 30s and the 40s so far, and they're on their way. But no, I was the same thing back in that era, before things became a little more specialized, and before we learned some more professional ways of doing things, which has a lot of positives to it. One of the negatives from what you're telling me is with that, well, let me know, what is it about the way church methodology changed that makes it more likely today that they're not ready to work with children with disability in the life of the church?
Well, I think any church can be ready to be inclusive, no matter what the size, no matter what you have going on. But I think one of the things that was helpful back when I was growing up in churches, it was before churches became larger. Most churches, they were just your local community. And so what was nice about that is people really got to know our family. and everyone kind of knew everyone. So with the acceptance level of different behavior was easier. I really think the biggest things though were, one of the things I think is really challenging in a lot of churches. Now this can happen in a small church, but often happens in the larger church, is when you have the worship service that feels more like a concert, where there's a lot of flashing lights and there's really high volume, there's crowds and crowds of people. That can be really difficult for a lot of people with autism or other sensory issues, because there's so much sensory input coming in that it can feel really bad on the inside. So that can be hard to go to a church like that. It was easier, I think, for my brother when I was growing up. We had, it was back in the day, you had like 10 people in the church choir with the robes, and,
Right,
you kind of knew what to expect every week. And some of these things that were present then and may also be present in some of your small churches today actually work in favor of disability inclusion.
Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, as anybody who knows this ministry or has listened to this podcast knows, while we specialize in small churches, we are not anti-big church at all.
Right.
And I know
Yeah.
that's not what you're saying either.
Nope.
But every size of church and every type of church, while it has positives, also has potential downsides for us to be
Mhm.
aware of and
Yeah.
challenges that we need to work through. And one of the challenges of the big church, as you're describing it to me, I'm seeing that very, very obviously, that sensory
Mhm.
overload,
Mhm.
especially for folks who, like you're describing with autism, and a lot of the things that we like where we change things up and it's new and it's fresh, that
Mhm.
the fact that it's
It's
changing so
hard.
quickly can also be a challenge there.
That's
So
correct.
when we're talking about ministry that has disability inclusion as part of it, I think for a lot of our
Mhm.
small church pastors, maybe they think, well, that's something for a bigger church that has a disability ministry.
Right.
But
Yeah.
in fact, there are ways that the small church can serve that are actually uniquely helpful because of the small size.
That's correct. And just to give you a little bit more background. So for me, I grew up and I got my degree in art and design and illustration. And then I accidentally fell into a job at my church, which is a medium-sized church. So the church I go to is a couple hundred people, kind of in between the big and the small. But it was at the size where we were not able to hire a staff person to run a disability ministry. So when I asked if we could start one, we designed the ministry to be volunteer-led, which is a completely different format than a lot of the larger churches. But
Yeah.
what we learned in that is what works for smaller churches. So part of what is cool about Wonderful Works is our resources are for everybody, but for this conversation today, we do understand the differences between being a small church and being a large church and trying to do inclusion. And I also reached out to a couple of my friends who are pastors at legitimately small churches and asked them these questions. Why are smaller churches afraid to do disability inclusion so often? Why, when someone comes, do they say, go to the big church down the street instead of stopping to say, how can we help you? So they had some interesting answers and some interesting solutions.
Yeah. Well, let's go through what were some of their answers and solutions then? I'd love to hear that.
Okay, so both of them, so I interviewed two of them. Both of them had the same answer. And they said the biggest reason why small churches do that is fear. Now,
Hmm.
interestingly, when we talked to all churches and all church pastors, like a year or two ago when we were doing another talk, regardless of the size of church, that was the number one answer why churches don't do disability inclusion is fear. So what we are finding is if you start by changing your mindset, you're already going to be starting down the road to being more inclusive. So I think for the smaller churches, there was a fear of comparison to others. So a lot of times when you look at churches that are doing disability ministry well, especially if you're just looking online or something, you're going to see the bigger churches because they have a staff person and they may have a social media person and all these things. So you may think that you can only do this well if you have a large church. Or they may look at some of the larger churches have all kinds of different types of disability ministry and a lot of outreach for disability ministry. Well, we know, and I know from starting a disability ministry that was volunteer led, you're probably not going to be able to start with outreach. You really need to start with inreach, and that's okay. So it's understanding that there are different wins, so to speak, in disability inclusion, and you shouldn't compare yourself. And then, of course, another one is a lot of small churches are afraid they don't have enough volunteers, right? I know
Mm.
that is a big one we hear a
Yeah.
lot. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what we've been hearing is start with believe that you can do something and go from there.
Yeah, that's huge because anybody who's heard me, especially at a conference talk, one of the first things that I talk about is pastors of small churches and leaders in small churches often feel like they can't be a great, effective, and successful
Mhm.
church until they get bigger. And I tell
Right.
them, if that's what you believe, then that will be true.
Yeah. Right.
But the moment you understand that you can be an effective church at the size you currently are, then you open up the possibility for that to be the case. So it's exactly the same in disability inclusion
Mhm.
ministry as well.
Yeah, and another thing I like to just say to that, because I think no matter what you're doing, if you're building a platform or if you're a leader of a church, there's always this pressure to grow, grow, grow. There's all of this pressure to look at your analytics and say, am I successful? Do I have as many people as this other place? But truly, as a Christian, we should be looking at audience of one. That's what I was taught when I worked for our church by our pastor. Audience of one, in that is what I'm doing what I believe God wants me to do. That's really all that matters. And if you don't grow at all, but you are being obedient to what God is asking you to do in whatever the circumstances, then you're successful. So I think a big changing your mindset is changing your definition of success.
Yeah, I can see how that particularly applies in this type of ministry
Mhm.
because I can't imagine anyone choosing ministry to those with disabilities as the fast track to numerical growth.
Well, you might be surprised by that.
Really? Okay, talk with me about that then.
Well, I don't have a lot of statistics. I'm an art person, not a math
Yeah,
person.
that's fine.
But if you look at the rising numbers of people, kids with autism, each one of those kids represents a whole family. So when you
Mm,
say we can't serve your child, what you're really saying is we can't serve the mom, dad, sisters, brothers, anyone in that family. And so being able to take one, you're really taking in more. In our church, so we have had a disability ministry for over 10 years in the church that I attend. And our families who are part of our disability ministry, they invite their friends and coworkers. Some of the people who invited the most people to our church are people who have children in our ministry. So absolutely, it can grow your church.
so yeah, as you're saying it now, that makes a lot of sense because if you're talking about the typical, let's use youth group as an example,
Hmm.
and you attract a teenager and
Hmm.
that teenager has a way of getting to church on their own. I mean, every church knows that has this situation knows they can fill up the youth group and not really impact the family at all because that's just where our kid goes to youth group.
Right.
But if you're talking about children, teenagers with disabilities, it is a virtual certainty that the family is going to have to be participating in that process. And so you're really, so how much, let's
Yeah.
explore that a little bit if you would
Hmm.
help me with it.
Yeah.
So how much of this ministry then is really family ministry as much as or even more than ministry to the person who is has the disability?
Well, it's all family ministry
Okay.
because it affects everyone in the family. So when you're ministering to one, you're ministering to all. For instance, if the church that I grew up in West Virginia had said, we can't handle your brother, I wouldn't be sitting here right now because I
Mm,
wouldn't have been able to go to church. I mean, you
yeah.
have to think like my parents would have had to stay home with my brother. How would I have gotten to church as a 7-year-old? So you're ministering to everybody, and it,
Yeah.
it is it is a huge ripple effect ministry. And this is why I get really excited about it, especially for small churches, because I think so often we focus on outreach as a way of evangelizing or as a way of spreading the gospel, but in reach is just as important. If you are just really concentrating on serving the people that God brings to you, you are still through their lives going to be having a ripple effect for the kingdom way further than that.
Okay. Yeah, that to me is a real mindset shift that is very, very helpful, not necessarily towards the church growth point, but simply a preparation and expectation that we are really ministering to the families of those
Yes.
who have a family member with a disability.
Yes, everybody. Yeah, everybody.
Okay.
Hmm.
And as you're saying it, we've experienced the same in our congregation.
Hmm.
We've had experiences where a mom, parents, sisters and brothers, siblings have found themselves coming to faith in Christ, being included in the life of the church, and where we have surrounded them with just as much love and support as we have the family member with a disability because they're finally finding a place with some relief. In fact, it's reminding me in going through your website at Wonderful Works, you have a whole bunch of great videos. We'll talk about that in a little bit, and they're wonderfully animated. But one of the ones that I looked through did talk about, as a church, put yourself in the mindset of the family.
Mhm,
So we sometimes start with, okay, so we've got this child with a disability, and
mhm.
it's going to mean we got to have an extra person assigned to them or whatever, all the complexities that we think about the church is going to have to go through. Pause for a minute and think about how hard it was for that family to get to church this morning.
That is the truth. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk us through some of that mindset shift of being aware of what the family is dealing with.
Yeah, so it depends on the disability and the severity of the disability.
Right.
So no two families are alike, but every family that has a child with special needs, whether it's a hidden disability, like what I call living in the borderland, which is like having a child who's right on that cusp of a diagnosis of like autism or something or not, that is very stressful for families because their children don't look like they have a disability, but their behaviors are different. So everywhere they go, they feel judged. And church is one of the worst places for that when churches are not prepared. All the way to a family who has a medically fragile child, which could be a child who has very complex, multiple disabilities with a lot of hospital stays and stuff and a lot of like medical prep before they even get out the door. Either way, if you have a child with a disability, getting to church is sometimes really, really difficult because there's so much prep work that comes before you even get out the door. And
Yeah.
so by the time you get to church, a lot of times these families are already kind of wiped out. So being able to know you could drop your child off in the children's ministry and they're going to be safe while the parents go and get rejuvenated and refreshed in the sermon is hugely important.
So you mentioned, and obviously every human being is
Mhm.
uniquely designed by God, and we all are distinct.
Mhm.
However, in most churches, we clump people. We just do. So
Mhm.
you've got the
Right,
youth group, you've got the women's group, you've got the men's
right.
group. But when you're talking about disability ministry, the
Mhm.
differences are more evident and extreme.
Not necessarily.
Or is that, before I get to that, I want your correction on that. And part of
Yeah.
what I also would like you to address is, because I don't do disability ministry to the degree that you do, part of what I'd like you to help us with is language. Because all of us want to help and
Yeah.
to be sensitive, but the moment we step into this arena, we also want to be sure that we're not making assumptions or using language that is going to be hurtful rather than helpful. And if you can help us with that as well, that would really be a blessing.
Yeah. I want to start with language. So language is a hot topic. So preferred
Yep.
terms. What you need to know about it is instead of worrying so much about what language you use, just worry about your heart. Where is it coming from? Because the truth of the matter is preferred terms change all the time. And
Mhm.
currently, right now in the disability community, there's not even an agreement on which is better. So some people really like the term special needs. Other people think that is really not a good thing to say and they prefer disability. Other people have other opinions. There's even debates on whether you should use a term like autistic or you should say a child with autism. And the truth of the matter is all the people with strong opinions on it still have those opinions and there isn't agreement. So there's
Right.
really no way to get it perfectly right. So what I would tell you is do your best and remember it's much more important to try and have a conversation and make a mistake and ask for grace than it is to be afraid to have that conversation at all.
Got it.
And as far as your second point, I think it's interesting to hear you say that disability is different because it's a lot different than other things. And I think that's a common mistake people make
Okay.
because when you think a lot of people when they think of disability, you think of only like very obvious diagnosed disabilities. But disability is a very wide range and making adjustments. A lot of the people in your churches already are there with a disability. And a lot of church leaders don't even recognize it because
Right.
it doesn't seem severe enough. That doesn't mean that those people don't need adaptions or different understanding or some of these things we're going to talk about in a minute with universal design. They do. So disability is, it may not be what you think. Let's say that.
Okay.
It's
So walk me through that.
okay.
I
Okay.
am really desirous to learn here, and I will admit my ignorance
Mhm.
on this up front.
Yeah. So when you're talking about church, you're talking about what is your goal for church, right? So what is your goal for children's ministry? Well, your goal for children's ministry is to make each person feel safe, to feel loved by God, and give them the opportunity to learn their faith and to grow in it, right? So let's say you have someone who has dyslexia. That is part of disability ministry. That may not be something that you think of when you think of disability ministry, but that person, they're coming in, it would be helpful for them if the leaders understood that reading may be hard for them. And so instead of doing things the way they've always done them, they make some adaptations. So really disability ministry is about recognizing who God is sending to your church and making the adaptations that that person needs to be a valued part of your church. So you don't, it's not always every time. I mean, sometimes having like a separate classroom space or having a buddy program, that's very much needed, but that's not the only thing in disability ministry. And I would explain it like this.
Yeah.
So what we use at our church is called the pyramid system. And what that means is like at the bottom of the pyramid, you have students who need a little bit of understanding and a little bit of adaptations, and they probably don't even have a specific diagnosis. You just know that they struggle, right? So in that case, what you would do in your classes is you're going to get your classroom set up for success for people of all abilities. So you're not having extra buddies or anything like that. You're just adding in some of these things that are good for everybody. Then the next level would be students who maybe they have a diagnosis and they do great in general inclusion, but they need help sometimes. So you might have a buddy with them, or what we call an invisible buddy, which is someone who has special education training, but can float around to different kids. They just need a little extra help. And then the top of the pyramid would be the kids that have what I think most churches think of as disability ministry, which is the kids that have more severe disabilities. And you may have to have different policies for them or a different space or two buddies, but it's not, disability ministry is the whole pyramid. It's not just the top.
And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do to help us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Secondly, consider becoming a financial partner on an ongoing or one-time basis. Just go to karlvaters.com/support, where you can give through Zelle, Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon using your bank account, credit, or debit card. This will help us as we continue to put these resources into the hands of the people who need them the most. So that top of the pyramid, I think, is the place where there's the greatest amount of fear, uncertainty, because you talked about it. The main thing that pastors said was their challenge was that they're afraid. And is that where the fear comes from, that when you're talking about those on the top of the pyramid where the disabilities are so severe, they feel like it's going to be too much for us to handle? And you mentioned it earlier, so let's bring it back up again, that the staffing, the volunteers, how do we have enough people to be able to do this? You mentioned that was something to come back to, so maybe this is a good time to come back to that as well.
I think that concentrating on the top of the pyramid is where the fear is coming from, because pastors feel like they don't know how to handle it. But the truth is, if you start at the bottom of that pyramid, you start helping the students there, that will help everybody. And so what I like to tell small churches is, I think a good way to approach it is in two steps. So the first step is what's called universal design. So you want to implement universal design into your church. And universal design means you're designing environments that work for all ages, sizes, abilities. So there are things that we can easily incorporate into every classroom that are not expensive or hard to use, don't require a bunch of volunteers, that will help all your students, but are crucial for your kids with disabilities. So some of those things would be like having visuals in there. So if you go to our Wonderful Works library, you'll see a classroom tools section. So having these visuals that may show a visual schedule or break things down into first and then, things that help students who may have communication differences. If you implement those into all your classrooms, that's going to help every single student in your class understand what's coming next or what to expect. But it's imperative for a few things, like a big one where we see a lot of meltdowns. This is one of the places where we have the most meltdowns from children with autism and even with ADHD and different things, is when you transition from one activity to the next. So a very simple thing to train all your leaders to do is to set the kids up for the transition, is to teach all your volunteers give a warning before you transition from one activity to the next. So that's a little thing. It doesn't cost any money, but these differences are good for every kid there, but the kids with disabilities have to have them. So there's a whole list of things. You start there. So you start with the universal design.
Where do we begin to find the resources to understand what any of this means?
Well, you can go to our website, wonderfulworksministry.org. And if you go to the library tab, we recently were given a grant with the Church of the Nazarene to develop the Adapted Discipleship Library. And this has all the tools any church would need for disability ministry. We have over 50 training videos, which are like 5 minutes a piece, where you can train all of your volunteers on the different aspects of disability. And then we have these classroom tools, a classroom tool maker, so you can make your own tools. In that, on that classroom tool maker page, we realize most people, if they are not a parent of a child with a disability or been in special education, they don't know what these tools are, what they mean or what they're for, right? So we actually have, if you scroll down, like 2-minute videos that explain what each one of the tools are for and why you would need them in a church setting. So you can go there and you can start getting educated. And you're also welcome to sign up for a coaching and Zoom session with our special education consultant.
Oh, okay, terrific. I think I interrupted you because you were on the first of a couple of
Yeah,
things.
okay. So the
Universal
first thing you
design
do,
yeah.
the first thing you do is you want to set up your classrooms in universal design, so that you're just adding in these things that just make it easier for everyone. And what you're doing when you're doing that is you're taking anxiety levels down for all the kids. And you just think about yourself, like when you go into a new place and you don't know what to expect, are you feeling calm or are you feeling more anxious? You feel more anxious.
Yeah, a little
So
more anxious. Yeah.
yeah, a little more anxious. When you go into a room and there's all kinds of loud stuff and people everywhere, are you feeling calm or are you feeling a little more anxious? Feeling a
Yeah.
little more
The
anxious.
greater the difference, the greater the anxiety. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. So by going ahead and forward thinking how to handle some of these things with universal design, that is a big part of taking the anxiety down for everyone. The second thing you want to do is when you have a student that comes in who needs even more adaptions than that, you want to meet that specific need. So we have, again, on the classroom tools page, we have some forms where you want to have conversations with parents and ask questions to get the information that you need on their child. And then what's important is that the church and the families on the same page with what those adaptions might look like. So really, it's not as hard as people make it out to be if you start with
Right.
those 2 steps.
Yeah. What's the phrase? You're putting the cookies on the bottom shelf for us, which is
Yeah.
very,
Yeah.
very, yeah, very, very helpful because it can be, again, when you, as you mentioned, when you've talked to pastors, the fear is the biggest issue. So if, which is really interesting because a lot of what you're describing is the church reducing the fear for those who are coming in. But in order to do that, we who are leading the church have to be less fearful of our inability to do this. We actually can do this.
That's right. And I think that's, for me, that's kind of goes back to that audience of one. When you find yourself in a fearful situation, whatever it is, go back to like, well, this isn't, God's not afraid of this. What does he want me to do next? And I think that praying about that helps give you some confidence in the next step. But I find you start with universal design, then you meet them where they are. And then let's talk for a minute about volunteers, because I know that that is the third thing that a lot of churches are afraid about, and that is legitimate, right?
Yeah.
So there's a couple things. One is don't feel like you have to have a whole bunch of special education experts or professionals to be your buddies. Anyone can learn to be a buddy if they are trained properly and the lines of communication are open. Because one of the things that you have to know about disability ministry is you're going to constantly be learning. It's all about learning. And it's really important. This is where I think it's really good for small churches because the relationship with the family is so important. You may think you have everything going and then something happens one day you don't know how to handle. So you want to go back and talk to the family. So what we tell people is if you have a situation you don't understand, you're not looking for a solution with the family, you're looking for a plan. You go back and you discuss it. And the most important point is that the church and the family is on the same page with what they're doing.
Oh, I caught that phrase. You're not looking for a solution, you're looking for a plan.
Yes,
That sounds like a very important distinction to make. Walk us through that.
it is. Okay. So I've been doing disability ministry for over 10 years. Okay. And then I grew up in a family affected by disability. So I got 51 years
There you go.
disability experience. But when we talk about not looking for a solution, but rather looking for a plan, this is what we mean. A lot of times in churches, if you have a student who's having an issue, and let's say it's a student with a disability that may have some behavioral challenges or some communication differences, often the church will go to the family and say, this is what's happening in class. What do we do? And so they're coming to the family and asking for the family to fix it, almost as though the family has a solution that they're just keeping, not telling them. What usually happens is the families don't always know either. They're learning their child as they go along the same way you are. And so when you go to a family with this, we have a problem, fix it. And the worst, in my opinion, is when you say, we have a problem, you can come and watch it and fix it. Because I've seen this on some Facebook groups and stuff where it's almost a shaming for some parents to come and watch and see what disruption their child is causing, and with the idea that if the parent sees it, they're going to be able to fix it. Well, if you have a child with a disability, then you can't always fix it, and usually you can't fix it because you're learning too. So that puts a lot of pressure on families and a lot of shame on families to have that kind of approach. So a better way to do it is to come to a family and invite them into what's happening and ask for them to work together with you on a plan. And the difference is when you're asking for a solution, if it doesn't work out, it's a failure. But when you're working on a plan, you know that it may change over time, and that the most important thing is communication and being on the same page. I think that takes the stress level way down for families and for ministry partners.
Yeah, that makes so much. As soon as you said that phrase, that's why I paused and said, walk us through that, because that framing it that way means you approach it in a better way. And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, you can adapt the plan, and you don't see anybody or any situation as a problem to be fixed.
Right.
But you're looking for plans together. That makes so much sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
You've created the Adapted Discipleship Library. Tell us what that is and where we can find it and how it can help us.
Yeah, so the Adapted Discipleship Library is a resource library that Wonderful Works Ministry has made in partnership with the Church of the Nazarene. We were given a Lilly Endowment grant, so thank you, Lilly
Yeah.
Endowment. And what that is all the resources a church might need in order to do disability ministry. So the way I like to say is, you catch a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man a fish, he eats for a day unless he has a fishing pole, right? So this library is the fishing pole. We are the tools that churches need in order to do disability ministry effectively. You can find it at wonderfulworksministry.org on the library tab, or library.wonderfulworksministry.org. And all of the resources on there are free. And we did that specifically because we wanted to see small churches be able to be disability inclusive too.
Yeah, I've gone through a bunch of the website, and it's very easy to manage, to see where you are. A lot of videos there. You also have a podcast.
Yeah, so we have a podcast called Wonderful Works Talks, and each month we interview someone and kind of learn their backstory about their ministry or their experience with disability and how faith has been a part of their journey. So check it out.
I really encourage our listeners to go there and don't just think, okay, we don't have a disability ministry at our church. I think, as we've been talking about, a lot of the things that you can begin with, starting with universal design, are ways that can prepare you, just like we talk about it with pastors on a regular basis. If you're not ready to receive newcomers, when that newcomer comes, you're not going to be prepared and you won't keep them. Same thing for those with disabilities. You have people in your church who have disabilities already. They may not be visible, they may not be known to you, but it doesn't mean that they're not experiencing some kind of discomfort or difficulty.
Right.
And that you can help to overcome that and draw more people in. You make a real point on your website to say, we are really about the Great Commission. That's what this is about. We don't want anybody left out of the Great Commission. And quite often, folks with disabilities are left out unintentionally. So
Right.
let's be more intentional about including them.
That's right.
Huge part of it. Well, let's get to the lightning round.
Okay.
Everybody has to go through this. It's not as terrifying as it sounds. At least hopefully it won't be as
Okay.
terrifying or painful as it sounds. But I do appreciate so much of what you've got. And again, I really encourage people to go to the Wonderful Works Ministries website. We will have all of those on the show notes so you can click on them and go there yourself. But here we go. 4 lightning round questions. First one, what are the biggest changes you've seen in your field of ministry in the last few years, and how have you adapted to them?
Well, I think the biggest changes came since the pandemic, and that was all the different disability ministries being separate. We are now all working together because everyone is online. So that has been tremendously helpful.
So the geographical limitations have been overcome to some degree, and that's been given
Right.
you a chance to. Okay. Right. So secondly, what free resource like an app or a website has helped you lately that you'd recommend for small church ministry?
I would recommend our resource,
That's what
library.wonderfulworksministry.org. Check it out.
Absolutely. Number 3, what's the best piece of ministry advice you've ever received?
Get a mentor.
Mm,
Obviously, you want to pray every day and you want to keep growing in your own personal faith, but also find people in your life that have good character and good experience and who will take your phone calls when you need help.
yeah, wonderful. And number 4, what's the funniest or weirdest thing you've ever seen in church?
Oh, gosh. Gosh, that's a tough one. Oh, okay. So years ago, we had a guy in our church who wanted to be a stand-up comedian, and his name was Ted. And he's absolutely hilarious. And our church put together TED Talks where he would come and do like do the announcements, but do them just like in a funny way. And that they were really good. So the TED Talks.
Oh, okay. Very good. Yeah, when you got the name, you might as well go with it.
Yep.
We had a guy in our church for a little while, and he was a joker, and we had the talent night, and we told everybody in advance, here's the kind of things we want. We want to make sure that it's family
Yeah.
friendly. We want to be sure that it's proper, and so on. So he got up and he started singing a song, and I can't remember how he introduced it, but he started by singing one of the secular songs that has something to do with God. But by the time he started, I went, no, 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 no. And he gets to the second line and he stops and went, oops, no. And then he starts another one and it's the same thing. And then we start getting in on the gag. It's like, so he starts with imagine there's no head. Oh, okay. No, not that one. And he went through 4 or 5. And by the end of it, everybody was on the floor laughing. But the panic at first when he started it, just like I was about ready to jump and grab him and pull him off stage. But he knew exactly where he was going with it. So he wasn't as wise as perhaps your Ted was, but he was
Yeah.
equally funny. So one more time, remind us, if anybody does want to follow up, and I really encourage them to do so, what's the best way to find you online and to follow up on any more information they might like to get?
Yeah, you can go to our website, wonderfulworksministry.org. The Adaptive Discipleship Library is in the library tag. Or you can join our Facebook group where we have ministry leaders from all around the world are together. We can ask questions about disability ministry. That is Wonderful Works Ministry on Facebook.
And they can listen to the Disability Ministry podcast as well.
Yeah, and Wonderful Works Talks podcast. Yes.
Terrific. We'll put all of that in the show notes. Barb, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for the ministry that you do. Thank you for helping me and our listeners. Thank you for being gracious with me trying to figure things out and even understanding how to even ask questions and the right language to use and reducing the fear that a lot of people have. But the emphasis on we want to be sure everybody's involved in being reached through the Great Commission, and we don't want to leave anybody out. And I'm convinced that churches are going to be blessed and are going to be able to be a blessing to families who are struggling with and who are experiencing the joys of their children and their family members who are experiencing disabilities. There's so much that we can be blessed by in this area if we lay aside our fears and if we step out to realize that everybody's included in the Great Commission. Thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me. We are really grateful.
Shortly after recording this interview, my wife Shelley and I took our 2 grandkids, Connor and Abby, aged 9 and 6, for an afternoon at the local park. When we arrived, we noticed that the kids' playground had recently been updated and the kids were thrilled. So many of the structures were reconfigured from what they used to be, but in some really fun and innovative ways. So during a short break from running around with them, I paused to read a plaque about the playground, and I was surprised to see that every structure had been built with disability inclusion in mind. So now I looked around and I had new eyes. The swings were lower. The slide structure had ramps as well as stairs and so on. If I hadn't read the sign, I would not have noticed how delightfully and creatively they'd thought about including every child's needs. In other words, it didn't feel like a disability playground. It felt like a playground for everyone, which was the point. So it made me realize in a really tactile way that what Barb and I had been talking about was true, that disability inclusion is important, and that while it will take some time and thought, the end result is wonderful. If they can do it in a playground, if the government can do it in a playground, then certainly we can do it in our churches, providing access for everyone, providing disability inclusion for the families that are dealing with the challenges and the joys of that. We can celebrate that with them. We can include them in everything. If the playground can do it, the church can do it too. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Karl Vaters. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Karl Vaters, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.